Okay.
My glasses? Is that okay to have my glasses on? Would you like to have them off?
Maybe off.
Off.
Yeah.
They'll remember me that way. Man had no infirmities. Hear, he could see, he could speak.
This is an interview with Poppy in November of 2004. Should we start with
Past history?
past history or birthday wishes?
Oh, 18th birthday wishes?
Yeah.
Let's start with 18th birthday wishes.
All right then.
Now, is this going to be for each one as he or she gets to 18?
I suppose, generally speaking.
Okay. Well, 18's a big year for all of you, each of you. And it's a little hard in 2004 to project, what could be 13 years, 15 years, 17, 18 years to get to this point. But clearly when you get to the 18th year, things are beginning to change. I remember with your dad how much he was out of the house by the time he was 17, 18. And who knows where things will be when your generation gets to that point. But certainly it's the beginning of a time in which you're leaving home, in which you're expanding the universe that you know into adventure, again, just like your dad did and like I did years and years earlier. I guess for your birthday, I wish you the utmost in curiosity, in humility, in a certain kind of humor that you can touch other people with and be touched by, that will somehow soften some of the tough stuff in life and break down some of the barriers and equalize people in a nice way. Humor always does that. In the curiosity of the adventures that lay before you, I can only imagine where you might go in the world as you'll know it, both outwardly, geographically, and inwardly in terms of where you go with your mind, your heart, your soul. And I hope there'll be a blend of both of those, adventures outside and increasingly as you go through life, combining that with adventures inside, because I think that's where another kind of real richness comes, which is what you'll take forward, which you'll get from your parents and give to your kids and your friends. So 18 is just a wonderful, it's sort of a fulcrum between childhood, the end of one era, another one going off to college likely, and I just wish you happy trails, safe journey, wings, wind under your wings, all those things, and I love you dearly and have a great trip.
Okay, Poppy. So now we're going to switch to personal history. But starting out with before your own personal history, going back, tell us a little bit about the family before you, where the different people came from who were your grandparents, and how they wound up in Chicago.
Well, it's a very interesting story for my mother's side of the family, the Strelke side of the family. They were living in Russia late in the 19th century, which now seems really, really a long time ago. But the Tsar was controlling Russia. The Tsar was very mean-spirited, very tough guy, and also very, very anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. And the Strelke family lived in the Ukraine, which is a certain part of, kind of the western part of Europe, just before you get to Poland. Things were very dicey in Russia in those years. Jews were being conscripted into the Russian army, didn't want to be conscripted. Some people in my family were running an underground newspaper. I liked the fact that they were a little bit on the subversive side, even back in 1880, 1890. And my grandfather, Avram, and my grandmother, Bunny, decided that they should leave Russia and try and come to America. And it was a very scary crossing. It was hard for them to get out of Russia. They had to get to a port in Germany. They were not supposed to recognize each other. The father and the children made a very difficult crossing to New York and ended up in Chicago. So there was at that point I think there were 4 kids who'd been born, 4 siblings of my mother's, Louis, Maury, Minnie, and Francis, I think, and then Shirley Ray and my mother Ann were born in this country.
What was the story of the person who was a revolutionary of sorts back in Russia?
Yeah,
I don't know if that was before or after the other family members left.
No, I think during, maybe before, maybe afterwards as well. there was somebody in the family who'd been imprisoned for writing an underground newspaper, which was critical of the Tsar, and I guess that wasn't allowed. There was an aunt who took some food to the prison and dropped dead in front of the prison door. There was somebody else in the family who was very musical, who I understand was conductor of the Russian Army Symphony Orchestra. But I can't verify all that. But there is a tract, an autobiographical account of this, which my Aunt Minnie wrote, and I'll make sure your dad has a copy of that. So in addition to what I'm saying, you'll get a fuller picture of their actual flight from Russia and what life was like in this country. For example, my mother was born, I think, on the kitchen table, and the sisters were up on the transom looking over down to see the baby being born. But it could be apocryphal, could not be true, it could be true. You've got to find that out when you read the story.
And your mother was the first to be born in the States?
No, my mother was the third to be born. Oh. Shirley, Ray, and then Annie, or Anna. She had all kinds of names. Anna, Annie, Anne. But she was clearly the darling of the family, and the cutest and the most modern in many ways. But that was my mother's side of the family, how they all got here, the whole Strelke clan. And they really were something of a clan after they got here. They all lived in the same neighborhood, mostly of modest means. Some got richer than others, being dentists and lawyers, but it was an old-fashioned Jewish family. My grandfather Avram died when my mother was 18, so I never knew him, but Bunya was sort of the grande dame of the family, and people clustered around her, you know, for Friday night Shabbat or Sunday or whatever. They were all very loyal to and loved Granny Strelke. My father's side of the family came from roughly the same place, but more, I think, Poland. That family is more a mystery to me in how they came here, when they came here. Our name is Olin, you know. There was a time when I think our name was Olin, O-L-E-N-N, and there might have been a time, would not surprise me, if we were Olinsky. In fact, I joke sometimes, and I think, you know, my Jewish Polish name is probably Czaliolczenitsky, which I thought would have been charming for me. But anyway, I'm not. I'm Chuck Olin. My grandfather, L.B., was really the scion of the family, the archetype of the family. He grew up in East St. Louis, incredibly poor, I think might have been orphaned, lived in the back of police stations and sold pencils on the street and fought his way out of the neighborhood and ultimately to Chicago, where he peddled scrap metal in the alleys of Chicago. And ultimately he was a big, bruising kind of guy, but with a soft heart. And somehow he bought into a partnership in an ice cream company called, I think it was called Lawrence Ice Cream at the time. And then somehow he did his partner in, bought him out, forced him out, changed the name to Goldenrod Ice Cream, and that became the big family business that ran from maybe 1920 to 1970. My father had two siblings, Ruth and Eddie. Everybody worked in the family business at 39th and Michigan. If you're ever in Chicago, you could go and see this huge old building where the family businesses were. It still has a clock tower on it, but no clock. We had a wholesale drug company and an ice cream company, and that's really what supported this large family of three siblings. Each of my father and each of the two sister brother of his had two sons, so there were 10 of us working in the family business. But I'm getting a little ahead of my own personal story, but that's the story of the Olin side of the family. We only say that L.B. Olin was my grandfather, who died when I was 5, so I barely know him. He's essentially the same age, Maya, that you are when we're doing this tape. And Loki, you know, I was a couple of years older than you when I knew him last. But he was a bigger-than-life guy. Sometime you'll be reading stories by Ernest Hemingway or learning about his life. L.B. Olin was a Hemingway-type character. He was a gambler. He played around a lot. He was a great fisherman, great adventurer, and a swashbuckler. He was big. And there are stories in the ice cream factory in the old days when a truck driver would disagree with him. He would about something like how many stops the truck had to make or what route they drove. He would say, "Let's just take off our shirts and fight." And whoever wins the fight wins the argument. And they would fight. And, you know, LB was a bull of a guy, so he probably won more than he lost. He also had a wonderful trait, which I've always tried to emulate. I haven't had to do it too many times, but he was an inventor, and he would walk into the office one day in the ice cream factory, all these freezers and machines, and he would say, "I think we need a wall right here. I'll put a wall up today. I want this thing separated from this thing." And then he'd put the wall up, and he'd come in the next day and he'd say, "You know what? I was wrong. Take the wall down." And I always respected the fact that as tough as he was, as bullheaded as he was, tough on my father as he was, he seemed willing to do this kind of thing, put it up, take it down, just because he rethought it. I thought that was a good mark and something you might remember in terms of not holding to things that don't go right, even if you think they were right when you started. Maybe, you know, rethink them and take them down. Can you hear her talking? You can't hear Nancy, can you?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But I'll close the door just in case.
I'll close it.
You can close it. It's hard for me to get out here.
My hearing aids, you know.
Let me pick up everything.
So, do you want to switch from old personal history? I mean, in terms of who's in the family?
Yeah, no, tell us now about,
Yeah.
you know, what it was like for you growing up, children of immigrants, and what your lifestyle was like in South Side.
Well, let me just say one more thing about the family is that because it was a big family, 6 or 7 children, my mother being one, and everybody had kids, and they had kids, and now as we talk in 2004, just like all of you are, you know, legacies of Chris and Regan, there are lots and lots of kids around who are who come from that strokey, you know, trunk of the tree. And my brother Richard and his kids, and hopefully Chris as well, will have a family tree which will show how everybody got to every place they are. But as of this recording, we have family living in California, in Colorado, in Arizona, in Toronto, in Indianapolis, in Florida, in Cincinnati. So as kids grow and do all kinds of things, the family has expanded dramatically. They're no longer in the old neighborhood, at least the Strelke side of the family. They're now all over the place, which is sort of a metaphor for how families expand. And I would think by the time you hit 18 years old or 20 or whenever you see this, there will be lots of kids around, lots of cousins and second cousins and third cousins. It would be great if somewhere down the line you get to meet those kids, because they're a cool bunch of kids, and some of them aren't even born yet, but it's going to be fun for you. My own personal history, I grew up on the south side of Chicago with my parents and my brother Richard, who's 2.5 years older. We lived in a wonderful house in a great, great neighborhood, which maybe you'll drive through someday. Our house was at 4929 Greenwood in Hyde Park, which is a neighborhood right next to the University of Chicago. Mostly big old houses, and it was really an old-fashioned time growing up in the 40s and early 50s. A time quite different from now, before television, if you can imagine that. Funky-looking old cars, and just kind of a different lifestyle. This was a neighborhood where we had lots of wonderful friends, and we played ball in the street, and went sledding in the backyard, you know, iced over the backyard to go sledding. It was generally a pretty happy childhood. I was a good kid, you know, good athlete, good student, and very cute. My brother was very creative and talented in the things he did, and everything was going along pretty smoothly. I went to the lab school at the U of C, and then a little school called Harvard School for Boys. Went to summer camp at Camp Menominee up in Eagle River, Wisconsin, which was always great fun for me. Lots of sports and lots of good friends. And then when I turned 13, my mother and father split up, which was really hard for me, and stayed hard for me for a long time. And they went their separate ways. My dad got remarried, had a couple of new kids. My mom and brother and I stayed in Hyde Park, and then ultimately sold the house. And my brother went to college, we moved to the north side, and then I went to college as well. But what was I going to say about this?
About the divorce?
No, I was going to leave that for, I mean, the divorce was very hard for me, but I wasn't going to talk much about that, except I grew up a lot with my dad playing golf, and played golf a lot of my life until I switched to tennis in the middle of it. But golf was a big important thing for me, and it was a way I stayed in touch with my father after the divorce, and before it. We were very close. I used to try and wear the same color clothes he'd wear on the golf course, matching, yellow socks and yellow Lacoste golf shirt, and I played with his hand-me-down clubs at a country club called Ravislow, which was, for me, sort of paradise as a little kid. It was this perfect, pristine place where nothing ever went wrong, and golf itself was sort of this, this perfect environment and a wonderful game. Can't remember what I was going to say, so let me just move on into getting through the rest of high school, which was fun. Harvard School for Boys. Our teams were the Golden Hurricane. There were only 25 kids in my class, if you can imagine that. 25. So we played every sport. I could play football, basketball, softball, golf, and tennis. And I had this white letter sweater with all these funny little chevrons for all the different years I'd won letters. Those are good years at school. Again, relatively simple, kind of old-fashioned. And then, almost by accident, I ended up going to Harvard College. I'd never thought about going to Harvard. Harvard's a very special place like Stanford, where both your parents went.
Which is, don't say that when they're 18.
Huh?
They don't want to hear that when they're 18.
Any school is perfect for you. Sonoma State, UCF, USF. When I was about to get ready to go to college, someone came through from Harvard College and talked about the school, and I didn't know much about it. I didn't really want to go there. I wanted to go to Cornell, which was a school in upstate New York, beautiful school, also an Ivy League school with a great golf course, and where my friend Jimmy Horwich was going. But somehow I applied to Harvard, which was viewed as the elite of the elite in those years, got in, and then everybody told me, if you get into Harvard, you have to go there. So against my will, thinking I wasn't really Harvard material, I was this nice Midwestern guy, I went to Harvard and ended up loving it, having a wonderful 4 years in Cambridge, Massachusetts, making great, great lifelong friends like Jimmy Dalsimer and Tom Cottle and Carter Umbarger and Fred Sander, people who I know even now as I'm 67, who I've now known for really almost 50 years, 48 or 49 years. So Harvard was great friendship, exposure to some wonderful education, and a whole lot of fun. It was still what I call the glacial 50s, which will probably never be repeated in this country, but it was a time when Eisenhower was president, post-World War II, no rebellion going on, very, very little. Things were changing in the country. McDonald's was starting, Holiday Inns were starting, superhighways, supermarkets, all these things that sort of transformed the American landscape. But in terms of the young people fighting against the old people, not yet. No Beatles, just before Elvis Presley, so no rock and roll, nothing like that. When I was almost done with college, I decided I'd go to Europe for a summer with my friend Jim Dalsimer, and at the same time I applied to the Harvard Business School, which at that point I didn't quite appreciate its potential value to me as a businessman, because I thought I'd go into the family business, like I mentioned, ice cream or drugs, and didn't need a big education because my last name was the right last name. I'd do fine and never get fired just because I was an Olin. So I wanted to go to Europe. I decided I wanted to stay in Europe and write poetry. I just started to write some poetry my senior year in college. And I'd never really seen myself as being particularly creative. I looked at my brother, who was an artist and hand-painted ties and tied fishing flies and sculpted and made mobiles, and the old days working on the train set, I didn't do any of that stuff. So I was sort of an outside guy. And it's like what I talked about earlier, when you start to go inside, especially if you've had some issues to deal with, like the divorce and stuff, you learn a lot. And it's not always easy, it's not always fun, but it certainly provides a different measure of who you are as a person, and I think informs you, your relationships, and where you go from there. So poetry for me was a chance to look a little bit into a slightly darker side. I was also in love with a very charismatic, wonderful, magical woman named Jessie Benton at Radcliffe, who turned my head all the way around and then tipped it upside down. She was going to be in Italy for the year, and we decided we'd meet in Italy after my summer with Jim. Some things happened during the summer between Jessie and me, so we never really had that relationship in Italy. But Jim and I went to Europe, and after the summer, I did stay. All my friends who'd been in Europe went back and started graduate school, business school, or medical school, law school. And I told the Harvard Business School I was going to take a year, and I'd let them know next year if I wanted to get in. So I stayed in Europe, and I had a wonderful, wonderful year. Not always happy, but a year of being alone for the first time. And I think it was, you know, if we fast forward to when your dad went away for his 2 years after college, there's some similarity. I think he might have been happier than I was on his journey, but if he wasn't, good.
Not always.
I mean, like I didn't have a camera and he didn't take a camera. He journaled. I wrote journal pages and obscure poetry, and wasn't really living the cliche of the wild, you know, wonderful, happy year in Europe, meeting girls every night and just having a wonderful time. It was quieter, but I think I learned a lot about myself, and have always liked that quiet part, even in coming back, and throughout my whole life have always had, you know, darker periods and lighter periods, and so that sort of melancholy is not a stranger to me, but I think in the end, if one sees it as melancholy and feelings, deeper feelings, it's not something to dread, it's something to go into sometimes and learn from, and even be joyous with. Anyway, so Europe was a wonderful experience in lots of ways. I did have some friends. We traveled together to North Africa. I spent some time in the south of France, a lot of time in Florence, met up with Jessie, but every time I met up with her, she had a new boyfriend, so there was never a chance for me. And that's okay. She got wackier and wackier as the years went by, and now she's a fairly dangerous woman these days, as the head of a cult for the last 40 years. I came back from Europe not really knowing what I wanted to do, but knowing somehow I was different than I had been before. I didn't quite have the confidence, I guess, or the chutzpah to say to my family, who was expecting me into the business, sorry, I'm not going to go into the business. I'm going to go to graduate school, I'm going to write poetry, I'm going to go to work in advertising, I'm going to travel more, I don't know. So I went to work in the business, and I guess nothing's really a mistake. It was your phone?
Yeah, hang on, let's pause for a second. Okay. We were in Europe somewhere, but I'm not
sure.
No,
we just come back to Chicago, family business.
Right.
So coming into the family business, I thought I was going to be in the wholesale drug business, which...
Did you explain why you never went to Harvard?
Well, I didn't go to Harvard Business School because I went to Europe.
But I mean, you didn't call them back and say I want to go later.
Yeah, when I came back, I didn't call them and say I was going to go there. I think the business school seemed almost irrelevant or off the mark after having spent a year of freedom in Europe doing what I was doing. That may have been a mistake, but unfixable now. Interesting, as a quick aside, I always, because I had a lot of issues with my dad because of his leaving and so forth, I always blamed him for my not going to the business school. I always said, well, my father told me I didn't have to go to the business school because my last name was Olin, and I'd get a job and I'd do fine, and business school wasn't important for running the family. I'd learned the family business from the family. I've held on to that idea all my life, and so if there were moments where I thought, gee, I wish I'd known more about business, like your father does, I could blame my father. I found a letter that he wrote to me somewhere in a file. That's why it's good to save stuff sometimes, in which he encouraged me to go to the business school. And it made me think back about how we construct memory and our own personal histories, and who we assign praise to and blame to. And it's interesting. Memory is a curious thing. sometimes selective, sometimes self-serving. So as you go through life, looking back on things, know there may be two facets at least to some of the memories you have. So anyway, my father was off the hook for allegedly not wanting me to go to the business school. So I never went to the business school, and I've made films in business schools over the years, and it's a rigorous education. Would have been interesting, but at that time it was way far away from me. So now we enter the decade of the 60s, which was a powerful decade for the entire country and for me as well.
So you got back from Europe in '60?
I got back from Europe in the spring of '60. I worked for a couple of months. I went into something called the National Guard, the Air National Guard, which was a substitute for being drafted into the Army, and served for 4 or 5 months in Texas, sort of meaningless service, and then spent a weekend a month for the next 5 years driving up to Wisconsin every month for a meeting. It's sort of a sidebar chapter that doesn't really mean much, and also I was very lucky in that I was done in 1966 as the war in Vietnam was beginning to heat up, so that people who were in later, many of them actually had to go to Vietnam from the National Guard, but I was already out. So I worked in the business. We bought a little tiny ice cream company, a little store on the north side of Chicago called Vela, V-A-L-A, which was named for Vela Noblet. It was a marvelous, expensive, hand-packed, handmade ice cream, and we took it and brought it down to our big goldenrod ice cream factory, which was huge vats and tanks and trucks and everything, pipes, and we put these little tiny batch freezers in one corner, and we made the ice cream one small batch at a time. It had whole Bing cherries, whole pistachios, whole pecans, gobs of fudge or caramel or marshmallow, and we had these women who would hand pack each pint. When you pack ice cream by hand, you crush the air out of it, so each pint weighs much more than a machine-filled pint. And in those days, there was very little hand-packed ice cream out in the market. So we had beautiful cartons, vermilion and lavender and black cartons. And my brother made the suggestion that every pint packed by one of the women with her ladle, her spatula, should stamp her name on the bottom, because it would really show to people out in the world that they were individually hand-packed. So we had stamps made for Darlene and Felicita and Victoria, and they got a lot of kick out of it, because here they were, the obscure ladies in the factory, but they became famous out in the world. And somewhere in a file your dad will have, there's a lot of advertising that I've done, and maybe even still an ice cream carton or whatever.
I'll just get the preserved Velas carton from back here, so that you can show the camera what it looks like. You can put it right in front of your face there, since you're tightly framed.
Yeah, here it is. Vermilion, lavender, and black. Vela's ice cream.
Very good.
Vela's hand-packed ice cream. There's the top.
Probably no name on this one because it wasn't actually packed, right?
Right, but imagine Felicita's joy. Anyway, I spent 3 or 4 years. I was given this little ice cream company to run. Remember, I had a brother, 4 cousins, a father, and 3 uncles in the business. I was the youngest of the 10. I was the only one who wasn't married. I was the only one who was restless, and I was the only one who, by the 1963, 64, was beginning to have some political stirrings about things like civil rights and later the war in Vietnam. My family was not very political, and if they were kind of conservative politically. I also had a motorcycle. I had a Honda 150, one of the first guys on the block ever to have, one of the first Jewish guys on the block ever to have a motorcycle. And then I bought a Honda 300 and then a red Honda 450. Well, I was a little rebellious. I had a green Thunderbird convertible that the company bought for me. I'd drive into the garage in the morning and go up and fill my own gas up at the gas tank. Everything seemed like it was for free. Anything I needed in the way of, toothpaste or shaving cream or shampoo was always for free. The gas was for free. The lunches were for free. Everything was. It was a wonderful world. Except I wasn't very happy with my family. They really didn't want me to grow my ice cream company very big, and it got very successful very quickly with great advertising and marketing. I wrote all these commercials for WFMT, the then new radio station in Chicago, for classical music. Designed cartons, did all kinds of wonderful stuff for the ice cream.
You remember any of those pitches right now?
The pitches?
Yeah.
No, they were like 1 minute long pieces. But again, you'll find some of them. You may not find the scripts, but you'll find evidence of the whimsy around it. You know.
Can you give us the gist of the message?
Well, there was the most important one ever was when right after we opened up the ice cream, there was a drugstore on the corner of North Avenue and Wells called Norwell Drugs, and I wanted to try and get the ice cream known in Old Town where we lived. So I wrote a letter. It was called an open letter to the residents of Old Town, and we sent out about 300 or 400 copies from Norwell Drugs saying, "Come in and try this ice cream." And it was a long, long letter about the Cold War and the fight for men's minds, and it quoted poets like Hart Crane and Wallace Stevens writing about the emperor of ice cream. You know, let the lamp affix its beam, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Let B be the finale of scene, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Anyway, I talked about the Cold War not being cold enough. That's why people were in trouble. If we could freeze everybody, freeze all the generals, put them in igloos, the Cold War would go away because they'd be too cold to move. So it was sort of a plea for a lot of things. And the nice thing about the letter was, well, it tripled or quadrupled business at Norwell Drugs. Someone sent the letter to the New Yorker magazine, which you probably will all know of by this time. And the New Yorker, very elegant literary magazine and news magazine. And someone published the letter. So my major moment of publishing in 1962 or 63 was the Norwell Drugs letter being published in the New Yorker. Anyway, so I had a lot of fun marketing the ice cream, but not a lot of fun working under or alongside the family. And in 1965, I created a new carton, which is the one I showed you, and a whole bunch of collateral advertising material that looked just like it: vermilion, lavender, black, ice cream bags, little giveaway things and brochures and stuff. And I didn't tell the family about it because I had asked for and been given the autonomy to make marketing decisions and business decisions. However, when they saw the new cartons arriving in the factory, they got very angry with me for not checking with them. They thought I'd ruined the business with these garish packaging, which later won a New York Art Directors Club award for great design. Anyway, they got very mad at me. They wanted me to pay for all this stuff out of my own pocket. It became a big battle at the family. People stopped talking to me, and it was August of 1965. And in the ice cream business, you were never supposed to take a vacation in the summer because that's when all the business was done. So if the family members wanted to go away, they always went away in the winter when things were quiet. But I was so unhappy with the family and they with me that I couldn't stand it. And I'd met Momo a year or so before then, and we were dating before we got married. And we had seen a movie called The Sandpiper, an Elizabeth Taylor film that was shot in Big Sur. Neither one of us had ever been there. And I said to Linda, let's just get out of here for a week. Who cares? You know, they're mad at me anyway. So she and I took this wonderful trip to Big Sur, went to the place where Sandpiper was shot, Pfeiffer Beach, had a wonderful week, and it kind of ratcheted up our romance so that, you know, I think 1 year later we were married. But when I came back, the family was still mad at me and I was still mad at them, and it was getting pretty dicey. And at that point, magically, and kind of because of Linda, because Linda had been involved with some underground film festivals when she'd been married before to Peter Bensinger Sr. And so she introduced me to some filmmakers, and I met Phil Kaufman, who's now a very famous filmmaker, then was just starting his career, and I knew him. And Linda and I each invested a little bit of money, I think $250 each, in Phil's $150,000 feature film. And Linda was doing still photography on location. I was still working in ice cream. And Phil called me one day and said, I'm in trouble, my assistant director quit, took all of his money out of the film, he put $30,000 into the film. could you come and help us on location for the last month of shooting? You know the cast, a lot of Second City people, and you know the city, and you run a business, and you could help us create this last month. And precipitously I said yes. Went and told my father. He didn't really want me to leave. He wanted me to switch from the ice cream business to the drug business and be back under his wing. But I said I wanted to do this. So I took a month's leave of absence, went to work on the production, and truly loved it. Working with young people who were not my family, people working hard, caring about every inch of quality, getting through the perils of filmmaking. It was just great. And when that ended, Phil said, would you like to stay for a few more months and be the apprentice editor, because we need somebody and you know the footage. And I said, okay. I did that in Chicago, ended up in New York when we finished the movies there, and I never had an idea of what I was going to do afterwards. And there was a thing the family had about anybody leaving, which was, if you leave this business, you won't do well elsewhere. You'll fall on your face, because you're only good because we as a family support that. It's going to ring three and a quarter times. Sorry, kids.
You know, the tape is showing 5 minutes left, so let me switch tape.
Okay.
I'm not sure where we were. Frank's Greatest Adventure is the name of the movie. You took the editor job. You went to New York.
Right, yeah. So, yeah, Frank's Greatest Adventure was the name of the film. It was John Voight's first movie, who became a famous actor later. Phil Kaufman became a very famous director later of some wonderful films, like The Unbearable Lightness of Being and The Right Stuff, films that years from now I think will still be around. Anyway, when I got done, I went from making normal money when I was running the ice cream company to making $150 a week as the assistant director on the shoot, and then $125 a week as the apprentice editor in Chicago. Then when I got to New York, I was making $0 per week and sleeping on friends' couches and eating at Tad's Steakhouse, where I could get a full steak, a gristly steak dinner for about $3.95. I also had invested a little bit of money in the stock market, and our editing suite was in Times Square, looking south, and you could look south to this ticker tape thing going, on the other end of Times Square, and I could watch as the market crashed. So not only was I making no money and didn't want to go back to the family business, had no idea what I'd do next, but I was also losing money from my first venture in the market. Wasn't a good time financially. One good thing that did happen during that period is I ran into Carly Simon, who became just briefly a squeeze of mine, and that was kind of fun. She was a wonderful woman. I came back to Chicago, not knowing what I was going to do and not wanting to go back to the family business, but really quite concerned about what the next step was going to be. I forgot to mention, at this point, I was living in Old Town, right around the corner from Second City, which was this wonderful improv theater, sort of a bastion of Chicago comics. And I would go there every night. I was very friendly with a guy named David Steinberg, Duddy Steinberg. I'd go every night and watch the improv show after the main show. And often I'd sit down in the bar and talk to Benny, the one-armed bartender. And I was there one night and actually I studied some improv also with a woman named Viola Spolin. Learned how to do interesting things on stage, which maybe some of you will do, just like I watched your hula dancing last night on Thanksgiving night of 2004. Who knows what you do on stage in the future. But I was down there trying to figure out what to do with my life. There was a real pretty blonde woman sitting at the bar having a drink. I started to talk to her, tried to kind of cozy up to her, and told her I was a filmmaker. I thought that might impress her. But in fact, she said, oh, that's interesting. My husband is a filmmaker, and you should talk with him because he's starting a new film studio and maybe you can get a job, which I really needed. So I went to, met Mike Gray, went to see him a couple days later, and ended up getting hired as the sales manager for this fledgling film production company that was going to do documentaries and TV commercials kind of back to back. And that really was the beginning of a true change of my life. Frank's Greatest Adventure was like the bridge to the other side. And working with Mike Gray, Jim Dennett, Bill Cottle, Jay Litvin, Ron Pitts, all these people who I grew to be so close to and with whom I worked so hard with, was just wonderful. So I started as a sales manager, trying to find us TV commercial business to produce, and then we began to do documentaries. And I became a producer, then a writer-producer, then a director-writer-producer, which I guess 40 years later I still am. So this is now 1966, and things are really changing in the world. The Vietnam War is becoming bigger and bigger, less and less popular. The civil rights movement is all over the country. Wild women's issues are coming up. Music is changing dramatically. Clothes, there's sort of a youth culture there never had been before.
Did you get to see the first Beatles show with my mom?
Yeah, and with Linda and my cousin Bobby Diamond. We went to see the Beatles at the amphitheater, and everybody screamed so loud I couldn't believe it. Now that screaming is normal, but then it was amazing, truly amazing. So those were very interesting times. They became more and more interesting as time went by. I got involved with an anti-war businessmen's group in 1967. Linda and I got married in 1967 during the huge snowstorm in Chicago where the roof fell in on McCormick Place, where the rabbi had to push our car out of a snowdrift. It was a snowy time.
Can you just talk briefly about how you two met?
Linda and I?
For the first time?
Yeah. Momo and I met in, I think it was 64. And we met because, again, I was at Second City, and I knew a friend of hers. She and I had a mutual friend named Susan Levine, very close friend of hers. And Linda had been at Second City at the show with Susan Levine and her husband, her then husband Aubrey, and a date. And as they walked out, they saw me. I had my motorcycle parked in front of Second City. And remember, this is a time where we were all trying to rebel a little bit, do some interesting things, do some different things, taste different kind of life. And I guess Linda saw my motorcycle, got introduced to me by Susan Levine, and told Susan later, you know, I'd like to go out with that guy. I'd like to go out with a guy with a motorcycle. So Aubrey Kaplan called me the next day. Her name was Susan Kaplan then. Called me the next day and said, how would you like to go out with this woman, Linda Bensinger, that we met last night? And I said, okay. And so Linda and I began dating. She still lived on Astor Street. And Peter was 6. And Chris was nowhere in sight. And so we had a wonderful dating time on my motorcycle. And then ultimately got, after some, fits and starts, like all my relationships are, finally got married. So, and then Chris was born. Your dad was born about a year and a half later, in November of 1968, on Election Day, the same day that Richard Nixon, one of our worst presidents ever, was elected president. And I always had kind of felt like we came out okay because Chris was the best of all times and Nixon was the worst of all. We at least broke even for November 4th, 68. And so I kept working in the film business, and our family grew a little bit bigger. Chris and Peter, Linda and I living at 1700 Crilly Court, a house which you may already have seen, but certainly will see at some point. And politics got wilder and wilder until 1968, when the Democratic Convention came to Chicago, and the anti-war protest activists, kids, were confronted by the police, and there was a big battle on Michigan Avenue, and you can see that film anytime as well, called American Revolution 2, or the Battle for Michigan Avenue. And we went down there and we filmed it, and we all got, the word is politicized. We all went from being, nominally involved with politics or anti-war or pro-civil rights to dramatically anti-war and anti-police and anti-establishment. And that wasn't so strange for the late 60s. It was a time in which tensions were very high. People were very critical of so many institutions of government, business, church, medicine, whatever. So we did a film called American Revolution 2, followed by a film called The Murder of Fred Hampton, about the death of a Black Panther leader in Chicago. Black Panthers were a radical black party that were fighting for an end to police harassment and food for kids and free medical care, and they were being gunned down across the country by police and by the government for their radical ways. They were a scary bunch, but they in fact had interesting views that even to this day hold real water. So there were political times between 1968 and 1970 or 71 where I made a film called 8 Flags for 99 Cents about the war in Vietnam in a white working class neighborhood, where I was trying to see why people supported the war so much, and was anybody beginning to question this war, a war in which so many of their kids had been killed or certainly had been serving or wounded. And it was that's around too, that will always be around. That's one of my maybe my proudest early film. I don't want to go through the whole film career because it's 40 years long and it's too many titles, but I've written, and your dad will have, and hopefully I'll be able to polish it and work on it more in the future, but about a 100-page memoir of going back over some of this history of Harvard, Europe, ice cream, film, and all these years, and you'll see it more in detail. But in a nutshell, it's been a progression of going from where I started, which was not a filmmaker, and in a kind of well-to-do, middle-class Jewish family and community where I felt pretty well taken care of, I guess. Everything was on my side. And in the course of 40 years of filmmaking, sometimes with sort of the small, ordinary people of the world who were working in a factory or struggling to make ends meet one way or another, or the big issues like human rights and indigenous rights and history and so forth, where issues are on a much bigger scale and sort of mean more to more people, I've come to have a deep appreciation for people unlike me, unlike you guys, who come from very different backgrounds, who've wanted a different kind of life, have had trouble getting to it, maybe have had no voice in making it happen. And while that's not true of every film I've ever done, I think what I learned in the 60s has stayed with me, and maybe what I learned even in quarreling with my own family, was that the underdog deserves to be heard, and often has very, very, very kind of righteous needs that aren't being met, and they're not being met by people who have more power, more money, more entrenched, sometimes more guns, tanks, whatever it is. So the proudest part of my film career probably has been representing those people in my more important films and probing their consciousness and their hopes and dreams. And the other important thing for me, which maybe is what I started with in talking about humility, is that the act of listening to so many different people in so many different places, from Eskimo hunters to tugboat captains to crooks to presidents of countries and presidents of companies and forklift operators and pregnant teenagers and everything else. Don't get pregnant. You could just pick it up and say, or let it do its thing. You only have 5 more minutes, right?
Yeah. This is your line, right?
Yeah.
Hang on. We're at
is it what I said to you in front about humility? I think the act of listening to people. When you're a filmmaker, you don't interrupt people. You don't want to get your voice on the track, so you nod. When they stop, you encourage more conversation. And whatever I've heard from all those people and all those really wonderful relationships I've created so intensely from behind the camera to in front of the camera has informed me in a way that I think really has created those values that made me build on values that I already had, but even strengthened them with a sense that kind of we're all in this together, and people deserve their shot, and the people who deny them their shot ought to be shot. Now, they ought to be at least, give ground so people can do what they have to do to live lives they want to live. So that's my career in a nutshell, but I think you can learn more about it from other sources than me rambling on for hours about it. let me fast forward into, we've got a few minutes left?
Between 5 and 10 minutes.
Okay. Do you have any other questions that are on your list?
That was very good. That last part, I was going to ask you about those things, but you volunteered in those last 2 points. I was going to ask you what you have learned about people, and is there a theme that permeates your movies, but I feel like you just communicated that. Just give me, 2 or 3 favorite memories or moments, in the filmmaking process or afterwards that, you look back on and say, God, those were just great moments, either when the films were being seen or when you were shooting them.
Okay. I think the act of filmmaking is often difficult. It's hard to get good stuff. It's hard to find good people. It's hard to find the time. It's hard to shoot it right. Hard to cut it right. So while the films end up being these expressions that often look very good, the process of getting there is one of great elation and often great peril. It can be financial peril over not having enough money. It can be just going somewhere and trying to get good stuff. I think that probably the Chagall films I did in 1974, the first film with Marc Chagall in south of France, right as I started my company, was particularly important because Chagall was this world-class artist, and it was my chance to start my film career doing something with a man of his stature. We shot in France, doing the whole film in French, which was very hard for me. Would not have been hard for your mom or dad, was a little hard for me. But just the excitement of being there in the south of France shooting was, I think, incredibly exciting. That the film came out well, and now, 30 years later to the day, almost to the day, having these films, this film and then the second film, was really a special part of kickstarting my career. I guess if we jump forward, I would go to probably to the human rights film shooting in Guatemala, up in the highlands with the Mayan Indians who were trying to gain their rights and not be hurt so badly by the army, murdered, displaced, was the scariest time I ever had, where I really feared for my life, and was proud to be there, proud to get out alive. Maybe it's melodramatic, but you'll see that film sometime, and just know that the shooting of it was very difficult and very dangerous, and we began to feel like we were being watched by the government and by the army and by the police, and were viewed as part of the problem. In fact, that's one quick step back to the murder of Fred Hampton. We felt the same thing. Not so different, in fact. Maybe that's part of what I was talking about in terms of what I value. These experiences that I've come through when you see someone who you've been making a film with killed by the police for whatever reason, asleep in bed, it makes a real impression on you. And what I felt in Guatemala was the same thing. These wonderful, innocent, beautiful Mayan peasants who just wanted to farm their land and be left alone and not be frightened and not be killed, not be disappeared. Not being allowed to do that was terrible. The flip side of that is being in Prague in 1989 during what they call the Velvet Revolution, when the Cold War ended, and you'll read about that, and the Iron Curtain came down, or the Berlin Wall came down. Being in Wenceslas Square with tens of thousands of people singing the Czech national anthem, holding candles and waving flags and honking horns and banners was the best. Doesn't happen very often like that when you fight for human rights, that it happens peacefully. And I think the final film for me would be the Jewish Brigade film, which is the most popular film I've ever made, called In Our Own Hands. And again, you'll see that. Wonderful, wonderful old men, and mostly in Israel, who had never had their story told, getting it told for the last time about what they did fighting in World War II as the only all-Jewish fighting unit, how they worked to help save survivors of the Holocaust, clandestine operations to kill Nazi officers, and hiding everything they did, that they told me with humor, with passion, with strong memories, stays in my heart a long time, like the work, like so much work that I've done, but with these guys, they were truly bigger than life, and thanked us for taking them out of what they called sort of the orphanage of history and giving them their own due. And many of them have now died 8 or 9 years after we started that film project. So their story lives in this wonderful film. So that's a few films that have good things. The final film, I think, because I'm shooting it right now, is the film I'm doing that we currently call Requiem for a Blue Lagoon, though we might change the name to call it Home. Is a story about this tidal estuary that I'm sure you've already driven past in your young lives and will come to know more, where all the birds are, right across from Seadrift, where you are sometimes for Thanksgiving, between Stinson Beach and Bolinas. And that's a film that has taken me deeply into nature, which has been part of the move, Nancy and I coming out here 5 years ago. I haven't really talked about Nancy, who I married 17 years ago, who's your Nana, who I know you love dearly, and she loves you with all her heart. I love watching all of you together with her. When you sleep over, when you cuddle, when she reads to you and makes art with you, just the best. But I think later in life, as I've gone back to doing more shooting, which I really never did, doing my lagoon film has been a chance to get very quiet, very stoic, thoughtful, really study nature and kind of bring it into myself or bring myself out into it in a way that I really never did much in Chicago. And of course we did it in the summer, we did it in our weekend houses in Hanover, where we had this wonderful farmhouse that Chris and his friends went to a lot with me when he was growing up, and later the house in Wisconsin where Chris was already too old to be there too much. But for me, those were wonderful times, and now I've kind of got it, instead of on weekends, every day of the year, looking out, right here, looking out to the ocean, and up there to the mountain, and this soft spot that's the lagoon that has become so close to my heart. So I think that's a quiet, a very different sort of thing from, the Jewish Brigade or Marc Chagall or the Guatemalan Highlands. Is just the quietness of nature and how slowly and rhythmically it moves and how long it's been around and how it's going to be around for a long time after we're gone. It's made me much more peaceful and much more appreciative. And I know your parents take you into nature a lot. You're in Stinson even now as we speak. So I have no doubt that you'll come to nature, or maybe you already have come to it in a way that's sooner and stronger than I did growing up. And just know that that's a great place for you to be.
It's a wrap.
Okay.
Beautiful.
The money that's stashed away that Nancy always thought I had, it's if you go to Hanover, Illinois, and you walk straight up south of the old house, which isn't there anymore, and you get to a big overhanging tree and you take a hard left, you go 10 paces, avoiding the cow shit, you're not going to find anything.